Okay, so the book of Ezra, and very much like Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, what we have with Ezra is originally Ezra and Nehemiah were one book, and divided again when the Old Testament was translated into Greek. And so it is coming to the Christian Bible as two separate books, but it's originally one account. And what you have with the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, is an account of the return of the people of God from Babylon back down to Judah and back into Jerusalem. So remember, for 70 years, the people of God were in exile in Babylon. This was during the time of Jeremiah. Jeremiah, amongst others, saw and prophesied the captivity. And Jeremiah also prophesied that it would last for 70 years. And so after 70 years, we get this return to Jerusalem and Judah. And it's a staged return. So the return of the people of God from Babylon takes place over three periods. The first period is covered in Ezra, chapters 1 through to 6. And that's the return under this character called Zerubbabel, okay? So that's Ezra chapters 1 to 6, the first return, the first wave, if you like, of people coming from Babylon back to Judah and Jerusalem. Then you get the second wave of people returning, and that's under the leadership of Ezra. And so chapters 7 through to 10 in the book of Ezra tell us about the account of Ezra starting off in Babylon and then coming, traveling back into Jerusalem. And we look at that, chapter 7 through to 10 in the book of Ezra. And then the third return, so the third wave, is under the leadership of Nehemiah. And we have the book of Nehemiah that gives us the account of what happens when Nehemiah brings the refugees, the returnees, back to the land of Judah. So 3 stages. And what happens in the 3 stages are different things. So first of all, under the leadership of Zerubbabel, the people of God return to Babylon and they rebuild the temple. And so chapters 1 through to 6 of Ezra is the story of the second temple. So the first temple, Solomon's temple, had been destroyed by the Babylonians 70 years earlier. And when Zerubbabel returns with the people, the first thing that they do is they rebuild the temple. And you have what's then called Second Temple Judaism. And the Second Temple, hugely important. It continues to exist up until the Greeks, when the Greeks conquer the people of God. And then in the days of Jesus, we have the Third Temple. And that, of course, is Herod's temple. So this Ezra is the account of the Second Temple. And the period of the Second Temple then is hugely important because it gives rise to the synagogues. The Second Temple itself is a small thing. It's not well regarded. It's despised. It's looked at as a pale imitation of Solomon's temple. So what happens during the period that the Second Temple is running is local communities set up synagogues. And synagogues then become eventually the basis for the way the Christian church is organized. So each local Christian congregation was modeled on the idea of the synagogue. So Second Temple, that's the period now that we are going to be looking at. We'll look a bit more about the temple then and how the temple is built and what happens to the temple. And then we'll see what happens under the leadership of of Ezra. And chapter 7 through to 10 is Ezra coming back to the land of Judah. And when he arrives, he's told by the first lot of returnees that they had taken pagan wives. And so the story of Ezra is Ezra's great distress at discovering this matter of intermarriage between the people of God and other communities. And so what Ezra does in chapter 7 through to 10 is he seeks to purify the community. The whole emphasis is on the godliness and the fellowship and the order and the organization of the people of God as a community in Jerusalem. That's Ezra's particular focus. And then, under Nehemiah, the third wave of people returning to Jerusalem, they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They seek to strengthen and protect Jerusalem from its enemies. So you can see the progression. The first priority is to rebuild the temple. Then the second priority is the spiritual well-being of the people. And then the third priority is to actually protect the people and to rebuild the walls. And Nehemiah is a very well-known story about rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. So we'll see a bit more about Nehemiah tomorrow. So there's the focus then. Two sections to the book of Ezra. The first, 1 to 6, story of Zerubbabel. The second, 7 to 10, Ezra and the community. I just want to point one or two things out to you then as we take a look first of all at the first section and the leadership of this. He's a royal figure, Zerubbabel. So look at chapter 1, and chapter 1 begins, as we've seen before, in the same manner as Chronicle ends, and that's with a reference to Cyrus. And Cyrus issuing this proclamation that the people of God are to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild their temple. When you look at the book, you're going to see lots of historical documents being quoted. So if you look at chapter 1 of Ezra, verses 2, 3, and 4, you have a document, the document of Cyrus, being quoted. And as you just skim through the different chapters, you'll see again and again that we have historical documents being quoted almost word for word. So in chapter 4, verses 9, 10, and 11, you've got a letter being sent back complaining about the people of God rebuilding the temple. And then as you look at chapter 4, verse 11, you get King Artaxerxes sending a letter back. And you get this throughout the book, letters being exchanged and decrees and proclamations. And it's a very unusual book, Ezra, because it's containing all these historical documents, and we wouldn't know, but those who do tell us that the languages are different. So you get the Hebrew language that gives us the account, but these documents are written in Aramaic. So you have a different language, which is then kind of lending a bit of authenticity to the fact that these are historical documents. So chapter 1, then you get the first of them, verses 2 to 4. And this proclamation is the beginning of the whole process of returning to Jerusalem. And if I just point out to you one or two things, you should be able to make connections with previous biblical stories. So, for example, look at chapter 1 and verse 6. So we're going to have the first of the returnees. And well, let's start at verse 5. Then the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, with all those whose spirits God had moved, arose to go up and build the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. And all those who were around them encouraged them with articles of silver and gold and goods and livestock and with precious things. So the people who were non-Jewish, the people in Babylon, were giving goods, gold, silver, and animals to the Jews as they were coming back to Jerusalem. Now, what does that remind you of? And you can make a connection here. And if you make the connection to a previous story, you then begin to get a sense of what's going on in the book of Ezra. So verse 6 is a connection to the story of Exodus. So if you remember, when the 10 plagues were occurring, you had the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, and that was the catalyst for the people of God under Moses to leave Egypt. Do you remember? They were given gifts by the people around. The actual word, I think, in Exodus is that they plundered the Egyptians. And you got that here. You got a sense that the people of God are being equipped and supplied with all that they are going to need for their return to Jerusalem. So there's a connection here. So if I just ask you to look at the book of Exodus and chapter 12 and verse 35, you should see the connection. So Exodus then, so we're flicking through our Bibles again. The book of Exodus, so this is just as they're about to leave Egypt, and verse 35, you read there, now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver and gold and clothing. There's a deliberate connection then between these two. So what you're having in the story of Zerubbabel coming back is a second Exodus. You're having the journey from Babylon down in Jerusalem, which is a mirror of the journey from Egypt up into the land of Canaan. We are having this kind of mirroring, if you like. Here is a second Exodus. And you're going to see the same idea when it comes to Ezra's turn to lead the second wave of returnees. Here is Exodus repeating itself. So I think that's quite interesting to notice. And then if you turn back to these first 6 chapters, we've got Zerubbabel, okay? Now, it's a bit confusing because he's referred to in verse 8 of chapter 1 as Sheshbazzar, okay? Now, there's a lot of debate about is Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel the same person, but I think we can take it that he is, okay? So Ezra 1 and verse 8, Cyrus, king of Persia, brought them out by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, and counted them out too. So they're having all this gold, all this silver, and there is the person who's going to lead them back. Well, we think he's Zerubbabel, okay? And so you flick through the chapters, and you can see that in chapter 3, when they get to Jerusalem, they start work on the rebuilding of the temple. And chapter 3 is an account of how the work begins, how the work is progressing, how well it is going. There's great rejoicing. The worship is being restored. There's the feasts that are beginning. It's all going so wonderfully well. And then, chapter 4, you hit a huge problem. So let's take a look at Ezra and chapter 4. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the descendants of the captivity were building the temple of the Lord God of Israel, they came to, and here he is, Zerubbabel, he's the leader, don't forget, and the heads of the fathers' houses, and said to them, let us build with you, for we seek your God as you do, and we have sacrificed to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. So these people now are the people who were living in Judah and in Jerusalem for those 70 years of exile. They were the transplanted people, and they were a mixed lot. Some of them were brought into Jerusalem and Judah by the Assyrians. They were not ethnic Jews, but they'd also stayed with those who had been left behind, if you like, and they'd mixed together and married one another and formed, if you like, a group of people. Now, they wanted to help in the rebuilding of the temple at Jerusalem. And here they come to Zerubbabel and they offer their assistance. And Zerubbabel refuses them. So just take a look at verse 3. Now, Zerubbabel and Jeshua, that's the high priest, and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses of Israel said to them, you may do nothing with us to build a house for our God, but we alone will build to the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. Then the people of the land tried to discourage them. They troubled them in building. So Zerubbabel says, no thanks, we don't want your help. And as a result of that, these other people, the people who had been there for the 70 years, they began to oppose Zerubbabel and the rebuilding of the temple. So much so that they wrote and they said, now look, you're going to, wrote to the head guy back in Babylon, in Persia, to Artaxerxes. They wrote a letter to say, look at what's going on in Jerusalem. They're rebuilding the temple. And they're going to be trouble for you. They're going to be your enemies. They're going to strengthen themselves. So the letter is written. And you can see in verse 6, in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, these mixed people, wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. They wrote back to the emperor, telling him what was going on. And he, in turn, writes and forbids any more work to be done on the temple. So all that great work comes to a grinding halt and it all ceases. That's the opposition that Zerubbabel faced in Jerusalem. And what you have in chapters 5 and 6 is how that problem's overcome. Zerubbabel writes in his turn, there's a new emperor now. He says, look, Cyrus allowed us to do this. Search your archives. You'll see Cyrus's original decree. Find that decree and allow us to rebuild the temple. Allow us to continue the work of rebuilding. And that's exactly what happens. They search the records. They find Cyrus's decree. And then finally, they are allowed to do the work of building. And by the time we come to the end of chapter 6, we've got the temple that has been rebuilt. So there's the first part of the book of Ezra. Let's move on to the second. And what I'd like us to do now is look at chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we have Ezra talking in the first person, which is very interesting. He's in Babylon. He's gathering together the people for a second wave of returnees to Jerusalem. And as you look at chapter 8, you can see Ezra talking about himself, and he's talking about his experience. So chapter 8 and verse 15. Now, I gathered them by the river that flows to Ahava, and we camped there 3 days. And I looked among the people, and there's a shortage of priests. I found none of the sons of Levi there. So the first challenge for Ezra, as he's going to return to Jerusalem, is he needs to have enough priests for this temple that has been rebuilt in Jerusalem. So he proclaims a fast, and he finally has the volunteers amongst the priests to go back to Jerusalem. I want you to look at what I think is a very interesting verse 22. He's in Babylon, as I say. He wants to come back, but he feels embarrassed to ask the emperor for a guard, a protective guard on his journey. So if you look at verse 22 of chapter 8, for I was ashamed to request of the king an escort of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy on the road, because we had spoken to the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all those for good who seek him, but his power and his wrath are against all those who forsake him. So we fasted and entrusted our God for this, and he answered our prayer. So Ezra's nervous about the journey. It's a long journey, and it's a dangerous journey. It's a journey in many ways through enemy territory. But Ezra is concerned for the honor and the glory of God. He's not concerned, firstly, for his own safety and the safety of his companions on the journey. He's concerned for the honor and the glory of God. The God who had said he would look after his people, the God who says, we can see it there, that his hand is on those for good who seek him. He's concerned that this God won't be dishonored by something awful happening on the road, or by the need for Ezra to have protection. So he wants God's glory and honor to be seen. And so he trusts that God would look after him. And what's really interesting there, of course, is the word hand. Ezra 8, verse 22. The hand of our God is upon all those for good who seek him. Now, there's two connections here with the word hand. It takes us back to Psalm 31, which we looked at on Sunday morning. My times are in your hand. Into your hand I commend my spirit. God pulls up and pulls out with his hand. And what many think Ezra is doing, like Jonah, like Jeremiah, he is looking to Psalm 31, and he's looking to that imagery of God pulling out that we saw. And he's asking for God to pull them out of Babylon and to deliver them safely into the land of Judah. So there's another example here of how Psalm 31 is important for the people of God in order to help them make sense of their experiences. But also the second important thing about the hand of God is it takes us back to Exodus again and the story of Moses. So if you once more go to Exodus, and this time I want you to go to chapter 13. Chapter 13, and we'll see there in verse 3 a reference that seems to be very much in the thoughts of Ezra. So Exodus 13 and verse 3. Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by the strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place, and so no unleavened bread shall be eaten. So when Ezra says the hand of the Lord is on those for good who seek him, he's using the same imagery of hand that Moses uses to explain that God, by the strength of his hand, will take them out of the house of bondage in Egypt and will deliver them into the land of Canaan. And here's Ezra doing the same thing. By the hand of God, he'll deliver us out of the house of bondage in Babylon, and he will then deliver us back to the land of Judah and of Jerusalem. So there's a really interesting connection again now with the story of Exodus, and it's reinforcing the idea that this return from Babylon, first under Zerubbabel, second under Ezra, third under Nehemiah, is another Exodus. It's another deliverance from the house of slavery. Okay, last thing to think about then is chapter 9. And in chapter 9, you got one of the great prayers that you find in the Old Testament. And again, it's not difficult, is it, to make connections between Ezra's prayer and previous prayers, and the great praise that you find in our Bibles. And the immediate connection that you can make is with Daniel, and how Daniel in chapter 9 offers a great prayer to God, confession of sin, trust in God and in his word, supplication, pleading with God, and so on. Well, Ezra does exactly that. He's heard about the mixed marriages, the intermarriage, and he's pleading with God for mercy. And as you look at the prayer, it follows the same pattern that you see in the prayer of Daniel. It's got confession of sin to begin with. So if you look at verse 6 of chapter 9, oh my God, I am too ashamed and humiliated to lift up my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has grown up to the heavens. So that's exactly how the prayers in the Old Testament begin. They begin with confession of sin, and then they ask God for his mercy. And of all the verses in this prayer that to me are important, verse 8 stands out. So I want us to end by looking at verse 8 of Ezra and chapter 9. Now for a little while, grace has been shown from the Lord our God. There is a really unusual reference here to the notion of grace. And grace isn't something that you see a great deal of, and it's not talked about and discussed a great deal in the Old Testament. It's going to be the major theme of the New Testament. But here Ezra understands that they have experienced the grace of God when they were delivered from Babylon. So there is a wonderful reference to grace. You can see it there. And then you get the second wonderful idea, and that's the idea of a remnant. And this is hugely important for Ezra. We've seen it before in Isaiah, for example, the importance of a remnant. And that's going to be taken up into the New Testament and discussed at length, the whole notion and idea of what a remnant is. Verse 8. To leave us a remnant to escape. Now, what's this next bit? I'm going to leave you with this next bit to think about. Look at what Ezra says in his prayer. To give us a peg in his holy place, that our God may enlighten our eyes and give us a measure of revival in our bondage. So you've got grace in that verse, you've got a remnant in that verse, and then you've got this reference to a peg. What on earth do you think that is? Some of you may have a different translation, and for some you have the translation nail, but I want you to reflect on what that is. And what is Ezra saying here? He's recognizing the grace of God in delivering them. He's recognizing that they're a small number. So by comparison to the old days, the days of Jeremiah and Isaiah, they're a tiny number now. God's people are greatly reduced in number. They're reduced in size, in significance, and importance. They are just a handful of what was once true of them. And then he makes mention of the peg. So ponder that. And just to, as one last thing to say, two of the minor prophets also are hugely important in the story of the book of Ezra. And I wonder if you can identify which two. So first part of the book, chapters 1 to 6, the rebuilding of the temple. The building of the temple stops, and two of the minor prophets step in at that point. And it's through their preaching and through their prophesying and through their encouragement that the people of God are stirred again to carry on with the rebuilding of the temple, to write that letter back to the king and to receive permission. Who are those two minor prophets then, whose ministry is crucial in encouraging the people of God to continue with the story of the rebuilding of the temple? So that is the book of Ezra.